To go?
Okay.
Are we recording?
Yeah,
Good.
recording now. Apologize for the delay there. Okay, so greetings, friends. My name is Beth Hawkins, and I'm the Director of Research here at ProSocial World. Thank you so much for attending our new weekly research seminar series. We had kicked off this series just last week with ProSocial's own Sage Gibbons. He presented part one of this two-part series focusing on the dual inheritance theory and theoretical examination of the symbotype-phenotype relationship. I thought that his presentation was exceptional. It was thought-provoking and even understandable to folks like me that are far from experts in these topics. So if you were unable to attend that session, it was recorded and it's been posted on our YouTube channel. So today we get to learn more on this topic from David Sloan Wilson, whom most, if not all of you know. But if not, David is the president and co-founder of ProSocial World. And I feel very privileged to be able to introduce him as our next speaker. So I'll now hand the mic over to David. Thank you, David.
Okay, great. And this research seminar series is such a great addition to our portfolio of activities. I want to encourage everyone in the audience to suggest speakers for the series. It'll be a weekly series, and it's so great. It's a big step on our way to becoming a hub for this kind of research. I like to think of us as roughly the equivalent of the Santa Fe Institute for Evolutionary Science in terms of being known as an international hub. So after Sage's talk, I was inspired to retitle my presentation The Adaptationist Program and Dual Inheritance Theory. That will be made clear as we go along. And so dual inheritance theory notes that there's two streams of inheritance in our species, the genetic stream found in all species, and then the cultural stream that's distinctively, even uniquely human. Right away, there's some qualifications. So some of you in this audience are familiar with the wonderful book by Eva Jablonka and Marion Lamb, Evolution in Four Dimensions, in which they recognize four streams of inheritance: genetic, epigenetic, social learning, and symbolic thought. That's an elaboration of dual inheritance theory. Dual inheritance theory does not deny that. Many other species have cultural traditions based mostly on social learning. So what's distinctively human about our form of cultural evolution is our capacity for symbolic thought. And then finally, we don't want to call it unique. I think that would be a distraction. I think we should be open to finding the capacity for symbolic thought in other species. We should even expect it in highly cooperative species, because symbolic thought is an elaborate form of cooperation. And just recently, I heard a radio piece on the bee dance in honeybees, which is the other example of symbolic communication in a non-human species. We tend to think of something like that as purely genetic, but what this study showed is that there's a learning component. And so there's basically naive bees are learning from other bees and how to perform and interpret the waggle dance. So isn't that pretty cool? So the main invitation of dual inheritance theory is to encourage us to think of human cultural diversity as like biological diversity. So after all, Darwin's theory has proven itself for the biological sciences, and it's now in a position to prove itself for all things cultural. And so what I want to go through today is, first of all, just to review how evolutionary science study biological diversity. That's my training. And I often think it's the main value that I bring to this whole study, is that I'm trained as an evolutionary biologist, and I'm taking my entire intuition and training, and I am transferring it to the study of cultural evolution. So I want to talk about what's called the adaptationist program as one method of studying biological diversity. And then, of course, how it can be used to study cultural diversity, including the symbotype-phenotype relationship. But as we'll see, the adaptationist program actually defers the study of proximate mechanisms, what takes place on the inside, until later in the process. I want to emphasize how the big ideas, the big theoretical ideas, can be connected to real-world positive change efforts. I want to draw upon my own research to illustrate many of these points. I think that my age, basically, having lived through the last 50 years of this, does provide a form of insight. And then finally emphasize the contribution of contextual behavioral science and pro-social world can make to the study of dual inheritance theory. This is very much a transdisciplinary effort, but CBS and pro-social world, I think, have a very distinctive contribution to play. Well, a lot of you know about Tinbergen's 4 questions, which states that all products of evolution must be understood from 4 perspectives: function, history, mechanism, and development. And because this is a research seminar, I'm going to assume that you all know it. And the adaptationist program, it's also sometimes called natural selection thinking. What it does is it begins with the function and history questions and defers the mechanism and development questions until later. In other words, it works primarily at the phenotypic level. And it's familiar to all of us because it's the method that Darwin used, since he knew nothing about mechanisms of evolution. All he knew was variation, selection, and heritability. But it's only one method of studying Tinbergen's 4 questions. I mean, in addition to leading with the function and history questions, we can lead with the mechanism question, we can lead with the development question, and so on. Ultimately, we want to be considering all 4 in conjunction with each other. So here's a classic example of the adaptationist program in biology. Male guppies vary in their coloration. Some are quite drab, others are brightly colored, especially differences between populations. And the evolutionary hypothesis, the adaptationist hypothesis, is that this reflects a trade-off between 2 opposing selection pressures. Predation is removing the more colorful members of the more colorful individuals, and sexual selection is rewarding the most colorful individuals with mating. And so what you actually get will depend on the balance between these 2 different selection forces. The mating pressure is pretty well present in all populations. So it's mostly the presence and absence of predators, or effective predators versus ineffective predators, that's going to determine the amount of coloration. So we can test this hypothesis at the phenotypic level. We don't have to know anything about the genes or the physiology or the developmental mechanisms that cause fish to be colored. And so here we have an experiment where we had the fish from a population with effective predators, therefore they were relatively cryptic, were introduced into a population with ineffective predators, and then that population was compared, I believe this was in the wild, with the original population with the effective predator, and another population with the ineffective predators, in which nothing was introduced. You wait and you measure what happens after 15 generations, and you find that the middle column there, the guppies have become more colorful. And so you tested, validated your hypothesis, all at the phenotypic level. Now, the adaptationist hypothesis does not assume that everything is adaptive. Instead, what it offers is a decision tree that can be followed for any given trait. And so we begin by asking, is this trait adaptive? And then, if yes, what are the selection pressures, such as a trade-off between predation and mating success? Or perhaps, what is the level of selection? If we decide that it's not adaptive, then why does it persist in the population? There's 3 major categories of non-adaptations. One is a byproduct of an adaptation, such as the red color of hemoglobin. There's no adaptive function to the color of hemoglobin. It's simply a byproduct of the hemoglobin molecule. It could be mismatched, adaptive in the past, but not in the present, or it could be a product of drift, a trait that doesn't have fitness consequences, and so therefore it just drifts in the population. And once again, all of this whole decision tree can take place at the phenotypic level, deferring Tinbergen's mechanism and development questions until later. So how is the adaptationist program applied to the study of biological diversity? That begins in some respects with this gentleman here, G. Evelyn Hutchinson, a professor at Yale. He was one of the pioneers of the study of ecology from an evolutionary perspective. He was also a very eloquent writer. One of his books was titled The Ecological Theater and the Evolutionary Play. And in a very famous article, he basically asked the question, why are there so many different kinds of animals? He was pioneering the study of ecological niches as an explanation for biodiversity. We have lots of species because there's lots of ecological niches. And in particular, he hypothesized that body size is often a niche difference. So if you have two species that are closely related, let's say in the same genus, one way that they can coexist from each other is by differing in their body size. And so when I entered graduate school in the early 1970s, these were the kind of issues that were being discussed. Here are two of my early articles. The top one was my first article on group selection. This became my PhD thesis. I have the honor of writing the shortest thesis in the history of evolutionary thought, to my knowledge, all 11 pages of it. But I came by this idea late in my graduate career. And if I hadn't, I was working on another topic, which would have been my PhD thesis, and it was on the adequacy of body size as a niche difference. And so, in other words, I was studying this classic question of why do so many species, why are there so many species? And my observation, my empirical observation, which was the basis of the article, is that if you actually study the size range of predators as the predators increase in size, and so on the x-axis, we have the size of the predator, and on the y-axis, we have the upper and lower bounds of what they can eat, that as the predator becomes larger, of course, it could eat larger things, but it doesn't really lose its ability to eat smaller things quite so much. If you imagine, for example, forceps of different sizes, a large pair of forceps can pick up a large object. A small pair of forceps can't do that at all. And a large pair of forceps can also pick up a small object, not as efficiently, but it can still do so. And this was something which was a new consideration for the study of body size. This was at the time when mathematical modeling was entering the field of ecology, and so to build mathematical models was de rigueur. And so if you ask me now what those equations mean, I'd have to struggle to tell you, so this was a model informed by this observation. Now, as I continued, I really wanted to work on group selection and community level selection. And I found a wonderful natural system for doing this. It's called foracy, which is the use of one animal for transport by another. So here we have a beetle called a carrion, a burying beetle. It feeds on not just carrion, but on small carcasses, which it buries to raise its brood upon. And all these mites clinging to it are not parasites. They're simply hitching a ride, basically. And in addition to the big mites, which are easy for you to see, if you look along the rim of its pronotum, you see those little white dots. That's another species of mite. So there's actually hundreds of mites on this beetle. And what I realized was that this is a natural commons situation. We all know about the commons and the tragedy of the commons. And the transport agent, the beetle, is a common pool resource for the passengers, for the mites. If they behave in any way at all, which damages the beetle or its reproductive success, then that's so many less airplanes taking off to the next habitat. So that I could actually study what we study now in humans, the tragedy of the commons, I could study it in a natural system. The main question was, what is the effect of the phoretic mites on the fitness of beetles? If community level selection is operating, then the mites should evolve, the phoretic community should evolve not to harm and perhaps even to help their transport agent. So that was my research question for about 8 years. But as it turned out, I could not ask that question without also coming back to biodiversity, because when I started to study them, I discovered that there was of these 15 species in the genus Microphorus, no less than 5 of them were coexisting in my field site. And so what would seem to be a tiny niche, small carcasses, was actually being carved up 5 different ways by 5 different species. And it wasn't body size in this case, it was actually temperature. What I worked out was that the beetles were coexisting both seasonally, spring, summer, fall, and diurnally, day, evening, night, was the difference that enabled them to coexist. And now those were only the beetles. If we descend to the level of the mites, then there were at least 20 species, some not yet described by taxonomists. And the smaller you get, the more diverse it gets. So nematodes and the microbiomes, who knows how many species. And in many ways, this was a precursor to microbiome research. That term was not widely used at all until the turn of the 21st century. Well, after that, you never finish with a system like that, but wanted to go on to another question. I started to think about adaptive individual differences within a single population. It's among members of a single species. So it's conventional to think of a single species occupying a single niche. Here we have a schematic of normalizing selection in which the mean value of the trait is adaptive, and any deviation from the mean is non-adaptive. And so the variation is being maintained by recombination and normalizing selection. But what if that's not the case? What if individuals within a single species, even within a single population, occupy multiple niches, in which case individual differences would be kind of a fine-grained version of differences between species. So I chose sunfish to study this, and with one of my graduate students, Baron Robinson, who's still doing this kind of work. And so sunfish inhabit 2 zones, ecologically different zones, the open water zone and the littoral zone. And so and in the lower picture there, you see sunfish. You can see some are more broad-bodied than others. Others are more narrow-bodied, fusiform. Well, there's a difference if you catch fish in the littoral zone versus the open water as to their morphology. And so we actually were demonstrating morphological differences between individuals in a multiple niche environment of the lake. And then we asked the same question at the behavioral level. This is work that I initiated with Anne. Anne actually initiated it and I joined it. And we can think about what in human terms would be called personality differences, such as shyness and boldness, and see if those existed in other species within a single population. And indeed it does. And so there's now actually a large literature, it's a hot topic, on personality differences in non-human species. So when we employ the adaptationist program, we can employ it at different scales between species and, as it turns out, within species. So here's one final biological study. This was actually the last research I did with my grad student Omar Tansi Eldekar, looking for all the world that he could be on the Bachelor, and on this wonderful creature, water striders. And it turns out that male water striders differ in their mating tactics. Some are highly aggressive, others are docile. And so our hypothesis here was that these differences are maintained by within and between group selection. So an aggressive male is probably going to get the most matings within a single group. And here's the actual study. So we're relating on the top right-hand graph here. This is the relationship between individual aggression and mating success within a single pool that varies in where the males vary and they're aggressive. So here's selfishness beats altruism within groups. The lower graph here shows the fitness, the productivity of all the females in a group with the frequency of aggressive males. Basically, the aggressive males are harassing the females, so they can't feed, and so they therefore lay fewer eggs. So here's altruistic groups beat selfish groups, and what you get is, in terms of variation, is a mix of both. So basically, within group selection is maintaining aggressive males in the population. Between group selection is maintaining docile males in the population, and that's why we have individual differences. It's important to note that the most adaptive situation would be for there to be all docile males. So this particular mix of behaviors is not good for the group in this particular case. In other cases, mixes of behaviors could well be good for the group. Okay, so we'll have our first pause, and we're taking stock. What I've tried to show here is that the adaptationist program can be used to study the length and breadth of nature without any knowledge of mechanisms and development whatsoever, as long as the mechanisms and development result in heritable variation. That's the extent to which they could be ignored while studying the shaping influence of selection. That's what's so amazing about the adaptationist program, is the degree that we can gain knowledge while ignoring the proximate mechanisms. And that's lucky, because their proximate mechanisms are very often more difficult to study. If I were to study the genetic basis of aggression in water striders, for example, it would be a completely different kind of research and would take a long time. Although I'm about to make the point that it's getting easier and easier. So none of this is intended to deny the importance of mechanisms in development, not at all. Full understanding requires addressing all four questions. So let's think a bit about the alternatives to the adaptationist program. What is it like to lead, to basically pick a trait and study its mechanisms or its development without knowing its functional basis or evolutionary history as a trait? And that's basically the way it was for a long, long time, which resulted in a disconnect between the adaptationist program, studying life at the phenotypic level, and studying it at the mechanistic level. So when I came to Binghamton in the late 1980s, and in virtually every other biology department in the world, there were different sub-programs within the department. In our case, one was called Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior. The other was called Cell, Molecular, and Developmental Biology. And they had very little to say to each other. It was reflected in departmental seminar attendance. We'd love going to the EEB seminars, didn't matter what species or question, but then we'd go to a cell, molecular, and developmental biology seminar and proceed to fall asleep at the questions that were being asked about this transcriptome or some question which for us lacked any kind of ecological or evolutionary relevance. And of course, the feelings were mutual. So I argued long and hard for the need for new hires to be able to do vertical integration, to integrate these, more or less falling on deaf ears. But then over the years, this happened on its own without pressing for it. It was just the case that when we had a new position, and the people that made it to the short list were ones that actually did a full-on Tinbergen's 4 questions approach. They were asking super interesting questions from all 4 perspectives. So why did that happen? And I think the main reason is because the techniques became easier. It was not all-consuming, basically, to do the mechanistic part. And so now almost every new faculty hire at our university and many others are actually addressing interesting ecological and evolutionary questions from an integrated 4-question perspective. I think it's a great sign of progress within the biological sciences. And an example of that, which is actually the example I used in my book, This View of Life, of Tinbergen's 4 questions approach, is the work of Richard Lenski. By chance, he was actually gave a seminar at Binghamton less than a month ago, March 27th. And his work on experimental evolution in E. coli is just a stunning example of how a system can be studied from all four of Tinbergen's four questions. All right, so now what I've tried to do was to give a sense of how diversity is studied in the biological sciences. And now let's move to this invitation to study cultural diversity in the same way. So what we can say is that cultural evolution enables human populations to adapt to their environments much faster than by genetic evolution. That's just kind of got to be true. Cultural evolution is the leading evolutionary force. Genetic evolution follows at a slower pace. The evolution of lactose absorption in adults is a good example. First, we had the cultural evolution of dairying practices so that milk became an adult resource. And then we had the genetic evolution of adult absorption of lactose. And as for biological diversity, before we get to the mechanism and development questions for cultural evolution, let's begin with the function and history questions. In my case, so it's the same decision tree, basically. The very same decision tree that we use for genetic adaptation can be used for cultural adaptations. And in my case, I applied this to the study of religion in my book, Darwin's Cathedral. And when that book came out, two other books came out at the same time, Pascal Boyer's Religion Explained and Scott Atran's In Gods We Trust. And then a few years after that, we had the New Atheist movement. And the two unquestionably most best-known spokespeople for evolution, Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett, both wrote books on religion. And so we have 5 evolutionary scientists studying the topic of religion, and our different perspectives can be understood in terms of this very same decision tree. What I was arguing is that most enduring religions are adaptive at the group level. And what they were arguing is that religions, for the most part, are maladaptive, not good for us. Maybe they were in the past, but no longer in the present, or maybe they're byproducts like moth to flame, but that religion is not an adaptation at any level. And in the case of Dennett and Dawkins, as you can tell from the titles of their books, best be gotten rid of. A delusion or being under a spell is something that you want to get over. And so this was the way things were in the 23 years ago. And now I'm very happy to report a lot of progress has been made. I'll share links to these articles, but my last article, major article on the topic, was 2017, and it's basically an extended version of this talk as to how not just religious diversity, but cultural diversity can be studied from this adaptationist approach. And that article is a target article with commentaries. You'll see that Ian MacDonald is a co-author of that article. It was accompanied by an assessment, basically, and which says basically that Darwin's Cathedral was a kind of a Rubicon. For the first time, we could begin thinking of, not just begin, because this is very much a return to the perspective of people like Emil Durkheim, but basically putting the study of religion on a group level adaptationist perspective. I want to tell you about a couple of detailed studies that we did on this, which are really cool in my opinion. This gentleman is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who is best known for his work on flow, peak psychological states. And he's the person who pioneered the experience sampling method. This is the method whereby you carry a device around and which signals you at random times during the day, and that prompts you to record your external and internal experience. So the ESM is a wonderful method, which is a very naturalistic method for quantifying human experience. And with Ingrid Storm, my graduate student, we used one of Mike's, as he's called, very large data sets of which included information on the religious affiliation of the subjects who were teenagers. And so we could actually identify these individuals as whether they belonged to liberal versus conservative Protestant denominations. And then we could sample their experience. And the point of this is that these two different forms of religion are actually, we're getting now into symbotypes, causes the youth to behave in very different ways. Here's a time budget for liberal and conservative youth. And what we find is that liberal youth, when they're signaled, they're asked, are you alone? Are you with friends, families, or others? Then liberals spend a lot more time alone than conservatives. And conservatives are spending a lot more time with family and a little bit more time with friends. And so if these were two different biological species, we'd be noting, the differences between species. These are differences among people who are under the influence of different varieties of Protestant religions. When you're signaled and you indicate whether you're alone or not alone, you also indicate your emotional state. Are you lonely versus sociable, bored versus excited? Do you wish you'd been doing something else? And how angry did you feel? And these lines here, you can see how different they are. In biological terms, these would be called norms of reaction. And if these were different biological species, we'd definitely be showing that they're different from each other in their response to their environment, in this case being alone or not involved. And in general, the conservatives are much more responsive to their environment. There's something about the way they think that has a big external component depending upon who they're with. And liberals, whatever it is, how they think, they've internalized it more. And so it doesn't change so much depending on whether they're alone or not alone. Isn't that fascinating? And this is a one-time questionnaire item. In my family, I'm the one to decide which friends I can spend time with. If you're liberal, which means liberal religion, and you can't decide which friends you can spend time with, you're really, and if you can, you're less stressed. If you're conservative, you're less stressed than liberals across the board, even when you're not the one to decide which friends you can spend time with. Once again, a massive difference in how people under the influence of different religious cultures think and feel, and how they ultimately act. Isn't that amazing? And closely allied research, which we discuss in that paper referenced earlier, is the work of Michelle Gelfand, who is on the board of ProSocial World, by the way. Her wonderful book on what she calls tight and loose cultures. And this is, again, very ecological. You can imagine that environments vary in their need for collective action. And so in environmental situations where collective action is very important, we get the cultural evolution of cultures with strong norms that are strongly enforced. And so this is in situations such as war, natural disasters, disease pandemics, and intensive agriculture, culturally evolved into tight cultures. Loose cultures, more tolerant of individual differences. They're adapted to safe and secure environments where experimentation can take place. You might be familiar with the work of Barbara Fredrickson, who has a broaden and build a theory that when we feel safe and secure, we become playful and we get to experiment, basically. We can't do that when life is too insecure. And a recent study by Michelle, she actually used the COVID pandemic as a natural experiment. So here's a situation where every nation needed to exhibit collective action. And what she showed was that loose nations, that includes America, had 5 times the infection rate and 7 times the mortality as the most tight nations. And so here's a real demonstration of mismatch, that cultures that evolved to be loose now were mismatched to a situation that required them to be tight. Okay, so here's now taking stock again. And so what I've tried to show is that the adaptationist program is just as useful for studying cultural diversity as it is for studying biological diversity. And in both cases, once we understand the evolution of traits at the phenotypic level, then in my view, that provides the best starting point for adding Tinbergen's mechanism and development questions. And when we do this for genetic evolution, of course, it brings us to genetics and epigenetics, all of the mechanistic branches of biology. When we do this for cultural evolution, it takes us to such things as beliefs, stories, rituals, habits, norms, institutions, childhood rearing practices, and most of these embodied in language. So now we're getting at the symbotype and beginning just to think about what it means to think of mechanisms and development of cultural evolution, the whole proximate side of things. And in my own work, I did this back to Darwin's Cathedral as part of my study of Calvinism, a new religious denomination that was a natural before and after experiment. So Calvin, a Protestant reformer, was persuaded to stay in Geneva in order to help reform that city. Prior to his arrival, the little town of Geneva was so dysfunctional that factionalism was called the Genevan disease. And among what Calvin did with others was he wrote a catechism for the city and also a set of governance rules called the Ecclesiastical Ordinance. And so what I did in Darwin's Cathedral was to work through both of these documents in detail. And with the catechism, he's talking about, forgiveness of sins and original sin and the whole predestination and all of these things, which sound so strange to, especially to scientists. But when you actually study them closely and you ask the question, how would a person behave if they actually took all of this on and believed in it very sincerely? And then you can see the functionality of this theology, basically, this religious belief system that Calvin worked so hard to implant, building, of course, upon the entire Christian tradition. And with the ecclesiastical ordinances, a set of very straightforward rules for how to govern the city, institutional rules. So, for example, the city was too large to be a single population to be governed, and so it was divided into sectors, and each sector was supervised by an elder, but the elder had to be chosen by the people that they would rule under. So you can see a little bit of Ostrom there. And one of my favorite examples of this was who's going to administer to the plague hospitals. And so there were 12 pastors, and one of their duties was to minister people in the plague hospitals. That's life-threatening situation. So what did they do? They decided by lottery. They evened out the risk. So think CDP2 of Ostrom's design principles. And they also elected to exempt Calvin from the lottery because he was just too important to risk his life. But the important thing is that was a group decision. That was not Calvin's decision. That was the group's decision. And when Calvin was succeeded by another leader, that person lobbied to become part of, not to be excluded from that duty. So this actually shows you some of the egalitarianism and what we can clearly recognize with core design principles embedded into the religion. It's one reason why the study of religion is so fascinating. And most recently, our work with Plum Village, to pick a modern example, follows along much of these same lines, including a vertical and horizontal component. Happy to talk more about that during the Q&A. Here's another study that I did with one of my grad students named Jascha Hartberg, which gets definitely at the proximate mechanisms, in which we observed that sacred texts bear a lot of resemblance to genes. They're replicated across generations with high fidelity, even have a segmented structure. And then what happens is on any given Sunday, as we see from this lower image here, is that passages from the sacred text are differentially invoked, similar to the differential expression of genes, and then interpreted to be relevant to behavior. And so this is like gene expression, basically. We can think of the sacred text as an epigenetic system. And so this could be used to study the proximate mechanisms behind variation among Protestant religions. Here we have extreme variation. On their left, we have the Westboro Baptist Church, which is famous for its intolerance. And on the right, we have a progressive church in Maine, in which are open and affirming churches. And so one question to ask is, how is it possible for these congregations to be so different from each other when they're both drawing upon the same sacred text? It seems hypocritical that religions can be bent to both purposes, but I think from an evolutionary perspective, if we think of a sacred text as an epigenetic system capable of adapting populations to many different environments, we can see this not as hypocrisy, but as a form of phenotypic plasticity, which is very impressive indeed. It gives a different perspective. And so this led to an empirical method that we could actually study the differences between churches by studying their invocations and interpretations of sacred texts. And since biblical citations are well preserved in the historical record, we could actually go and study the expressed phenotype of churches at any time or place in history. And so we did that for these two churches. And so our data was biblical citations from available on their websites. And so here we have cultural heat maps, basically. It's been colorized so that the more a book of the Bible has been cited, then the brighter the red color. And you can see at a glance that the two different congregations are citing different books of the Bible. Now let's go down and let's pick one book. Let's pick the book of John and look at the chapter level. And once again, we find big differences in which passages are being cited. And now let's go down a level still more to the level of chapters and verses. And now we find there's one verse that's frequently cited by both congregations. It's John 3:16. Anyone want to shout out what that is? Nobody knows? Well, here it is. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. This is the one passage shared by both. And even it's interpreted in very different ways. And so isn't it amazing that I just love this image because I think it speaks more generally to the way we should be thinking about cultural evolution, that what culture provides is not only sacred texts, but a common storehouse of knowledge. It might be something which is not sacred, such as fables or myths, or in our day, movies or songs. And at any particular moment, what we're doing is we're drawing upon this kind of stockpile of cultural resources that's apropos to the moment, and then we're interpreting it so that it is basically influences behavior. So I think that this is getting us actually a long way towards beginning to understand what we might mean by phenotype. So my last example here has to do with linguistic polymorphisms. And if adaptive individual differences exist at the behavioral level, then in humans, then of course they must be coded in language. And if individuals are speaking the same language, such as English, that means that the differences in our symbotypes must be reflected in the meanings that we attach to words. And this fascinates me so much that a human population which is phenotypically diverse, but speaking the same language, such as English, their diversity in terms of the proximate mechanisms must be reflected in a diversity of meanings attached to the same words, meaning attached to the same words. And so this is why we so frequently misunderstand each other when we use a key word. And one of my favorite examples is spiritual. That can mean so many different things. I think that's a reflection of the symbotypic diversity that underlies phenotypic diversity. And one early study that I did on this topic examined meanings of the word selfish and other words where by the use of the word, you can know what is implied about the effects of self on others. And then depending upon the text, I identified three what I call species of thought. The surface definition of selfishness is something which is good for the individual and bad for others, good for self, bad for others. But in other texts, and I'm sure that you're familiar with this is like kind of discovering the water, the proverbial fish not being able to see water. There's texts in which selfishness is portrayed as both bad for self and others. If you're selfish, that will be bad for you. Or in a modern context with Ayn Rand and other forms of individualism, if you're selfish, if it's the right kind of selfishness, that will be both good for you and others. And so here's one example of a polymorphism. Here's how I actually went about doing it by reading through a text. This is a traditional religious text. And what we find is on the rows, we have effects on others, plus or minus, and the columns effect on self, minus or plus. And what we find is that every single word in which you could attribute an effect on self and others falls into only two quadrants. There's a quadrant that's basically a win-win situation. So if you're brotherly, community, discipline, faithful, love, mutual help, obedience, sacrifice, surrender, true equality, that will be good for everybody. And if you're arrogant, avaricious, ego, greed, self-will, self-interest, and so on, that will be bad for everyone. Here's an analysis of the writing of Ayn Rand in which it's flipped, but it still has the same structure. Only two quadrants are occupied. Win-win traits, in this case, selfishness, self-esteem, responsibility, rational selfishness, rational self-interest, so on and so forth. And then in the bottom, what's bad for everyone, in the first column is conventional virtues, which are bad for everyone, not good. And in the second column, a list of stupid forms of selfishness, which we also need to avoid. So the message here is that if you're a rational, selfish person, then what you decide to do for yourself will be good for everyone. And both of these, this one and this one, although very different from each other, illustrate the concept of adaptive fictions. Because in any real world situation, if we were going to measure the effect of our behaviors on ourselves and others, of course, all four quadrants would be occupied. Life is full of situations that actually are good for me and bad for you, or bad for me or good for you. It's simply not the case that we have only win-win and lose-lose situations. So whenever you have a meaning system which looks like this, that's a sure sign that it's a departure from factual reality in a way that serves as a guide to behavior. And so I think in general, this should be a major topic for us all. Once we think of meaning systems as guides for behavior, then this is a huge step towards explaining the human penchant for inventing, believing, defending departures from factual reality. Okay, now I'm finishing up with a discussion of contextual behavioral science. And in the first place, many disciplines need to be consulted to study the symbotype-phenotype relationship. Evolutionary science is like the new kid on the block with respect to this. We have disciplines that are very old, numerous branches of linguistics, semiotics, the humanities have been all about have been all about this. And so there's a tremendous sort of storehouse of knowledge that needs to be consulted and organized. But I think the contextual behavioral science has a very special role to play. And so if you look at our two main tools, now the matrix, what is it? Conventionally, it's described on the top half as inner thoughts and feelings. What would that be but our symbotype, what people cannot see? And on the bottom half, our outer actions, what people could see us doing. What would that be but the phenotype? So whenever we use the matrix, we're actually making a distinction between the phenotype and the symbotype. And we're working with the individual or the group in order to manage that relationship. So we're actually working with consciously evolving the phenotype, because that's what we want the end result to be, better action, but by also altering the symbotype. So the whole symbotype phenotype concept is really embedded in the concept of acceptance and commitment therapy and its theoretical foundation, relational frame theory, as people like Steve Hayes is increasingly framing it that way. So to think of therapy as a form of personal evolution. And then when we look at the core design principles, we see that it's a form of governance. It's really a version of Calvin's ecclesiastical ordinances, a set of rules about how we behave with consequences if we don't. And so here's the horizontal dimension that we are working on. So this is a major graphic that we rely upon at ProSocial World. It's due to a guy named Donald Stokes, in which we have practical applications on the x-axis and foundational research on the y-axis. And so this is there's a number of quadrants. On the top left, we have purely foundational research. He names that in honor of Niels Bohr. This is just pure knowledge for its own sake. On the far right bottom, we have purely applied research. He names that for Thomas Edison, just finding out what works without big ideas associated with it. And then on the top right, we have a kind of research that combines both. It asks the big questions and it's immensely useful. He names that for Pasteur, who did basically made fundamental contributions to microbiology at the same time that he cured diseases. And I think that at the end of Sage's lecture last week, we all loved it. I did too. And my first comment was, I loved it, but it seems so intractable. It seems that if we're going to study symbotypes, that in the first place, it's going to be pretty hard. And in the second place, it might not be that easy to apply. And what I want to leave us with at the end of my talk is that it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, we could be occupying the Pasteur quadrant, and we are. And so we can be studying symbotypes and phenotypes in a way which is immensely practical, asks the big questions, and is immensely practical. So to summarize, I've tried to explore the basic invitation of dual inheritance theory to study cultural diversity as like biological diversity. I've emphasized the advantages of starting at the phenotypic level, the adaptationist program. We need to stress that the mechanism and development questions are only to be starting to be asked for cultural evolution. We have a whole vista ahead of us as to studying the concept of symbotypes. And CBS and our organization, ProSocial World, can be at the forefront of studying the symbotype-phenotype relationship in a way that's firmly anchored in real-world outcomes. I hope that was not too much of a fire hose for you folks.
Thank you, David. That was incredible, an awesome opportunity to learn more about your research that you've done in the past, and it was really thought-provoking. I would love to open the room for questions. I am positive that we're going to have some really lively discussion here. So go for it. And I can't see if anyone has their hand raised.
Sage is the first to raise his hand.
Excellent. That doesn't surprise me. Go for it, Sage.
Sure, I had this phrase that I put in the chat that I wanted to put forth, which I think has been helpful for me. So I said, thinking of meaning as an emergent property of symbolic information being expressed behaviorally in context, just as function is an emergent property of genetic information being expressed phenotypically in context. And when you said, and that snapped for me, David, I've kind of thought of that way before. But when you were talking about sacred text as a cultural genome, the analogy there of the cultural level as being kind of more like a genotype in that way, in its total space. But then I think we can just call it all symbolic information and just call it symbotype, and that can be in both the minds of us as individuals and in the culture. But what's clear is like the meaning of anything, just as you were saying, really comes from the context. If you just look at the text, just what people have said, or just what, you don't understand why they're really doing it. What is the function and the meaning behind it? So for me, that insight is where the development, and mechanism question become really exciting for microevolution, because there's almost no generalization just from the raw sort of information. You need the context to get that higher level understanding. And for me, that makes fields like contextual behavioral science, linguistics essential, because they're really good at drilling down into what's going on in a particular system. So yeah, that's my thought.
Yeah, there's a lot to say. Could you repeat the phrasing that you had at the very beginning, Sage,
Sure.
which is just to let it sink in, and then I'll make
Yeah.
a couple comments before turning to Liano.
Sure. So meaning is an emergent property of symbolic information being expressed behaviorally in context, just as function is an emergent property of genetic information being expressed phenotypically in context.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Well, let me make two observations that I think they're apropos to what you're saying. There's one kind of symbotype is like a well-reasoned argument that makes a persuasive point. I have another article I didn't describe in which I looked at a piece of persuasive writing and what its likely effect would be on the reader. But actually, Calvin's Catechism is a good example of that. It's very systemic, all integrated, and if you absorb it, and the whole point of a catechism is that's just part of the development, right? Tinbergen's development question. This stuff has to be learned by children in order for them to be manifest. So there's a whole piece of child development here, and it's a very integrated system that you might be now confronting what you're doing, and you could rely upon this system. But the sacred text study is a little bit different than that, and it's a little bit less connected. And there's quite a literature on this. People like Richard Nisbet, The Geography of Thought, and people who study cultural differences in cognition, and especially some indigenous thought and Asian thought is so much more contextual than Western thought, that what happens is you don't have like a big system. You just have this storehouse of stories or something. They're not well connected to each other. If you look at the Bible, it's a big inventory of stories. They're not connected to each other. And what you do, well, look at all the movies we've ever seen. They're not connected to each other in any way at all. But what happens is that they provide this resource, which at the moment you pull into this grab bag of cultural elements, and you pull out the one that's apropos for the moment, and then that's what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So I think both of those exist, and it's interesting to make the distinction, and they're quite different from each other. So I I make that as an observation. Liana?
Yeah, so I had a couple of things. I want to think, well, let me go back. So I was on your religion stuff. It seems to me that there are that religions use a lot of behaviors that are useful to humans, but there is no necessary or even logical connection between the behaviors, for example, of humans congregating, somewhere and doing things together. There's no need for religion involved there. So it seems to me like religion is acting as a parasite and using the things that it does that are useful to humans to maintain itself and perpetuate itself. But I don't see another argument. I don't see a significant argument against that. And maybe you have one. Is what I'm asking for there. And then I really liked your studies where you were showing the different words in different quadrants, because that it seems to me that's a characterization of the underlying moral narrative that are then woven into stories. And the issue that I have with what Sage was saying about meaning as an emergent property, et cetera, is that I mean, I agree with that as a general thing, but we don't learn in symbols. We learn in stories. We don't learn individual ideas. We learn entire narratives about how things go together. And so I think it's important to differentiate between what is actually being learned and what are the components that may affect behavior because of that learning. Does that make sense?
Sure, it does. I mean, there's a lot to say about it, and just to sort of make a few observations. I think the question as to whether an element of religion is parasitic brings us straight to multi-level selection. And very often a religion could be good for the community of religious believers, and that community can be parasitic or not. But as far as the group of religious believers is concerned, it's not at all parasitic. It's part of what makes them work as well as they do. So I think that there's all of those things need to be said. Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett, I mean, the idea of religion being good for the group so they have a category for it. They call it memeplexes, but they do almost nothing with it. And in their view, most elements of religion are likely to be a mind virus, basically parasitic on the individual, on believer. And that's once again an empirical question. And by my own assessment, I think first of all, the concept of a mind virus, a parasitic meme is a theoretical possibility. And in fact, we can find some examples. It's just not explaining the major features of religion. And the example that I am willing to accept as a parasitic meme is the religion that preceded Seventh-day Adventism. So before Seventh-day Adventism, this is in upstate New York in what they call the Burnt Over District. It was called Millerism, and a farmer named Miller was interpreting the Bible, and he thought that he had all sorts of clues about the second coming. And this was during a time when pamphlets and newspapers were just, that industry was coming into being. It was kind of like a version of the internet. And so this idea went viral, and all kinds of people were preparing for the return of Christ at a certain date. That wasn't good for them. And the date came and went, and that was called the Great Disappointment. And so they recalculated, and that day came and went. Most people went back to their previous faiths at that point, except a few just couldn't let go. They couldn't let go. They just had to hang on. And one of those was Helen White, I believe it was, who kind of refashioned the religion so that that turned into Seventh-day Adventism, which is spectacularly successful as far as the congregation takes that ideology, that theology of the imminent return as a kind of a psychological engine and harnesses that to healthful practices for the individual, missionary activities, community. And so that's like a multi-step sequence of cultural evolution, which ultimately led to something that was very good for the community. How well Seventh-day Adventism is for the rest of the world, we don't know, but that's where you have to apply multi-level selection theory. Let me go on to some other questions.
I'm sorry. There's a key thing there. You're talking about a group, but you're not talking. There are different groups involved. You have the group of normal adherents. You have the group of priests, and you also have a group of stories. And all of those things are evolving at the same time. And there's a question of whether the group of stories is parasitic on the whole congregation.
Yeah. And then and when I think about this myself, including when putting together this talk, I think the distinction between the phenotype and the symbotype really becomes blurred. For example, is a story a phenotype or a symbotype? Is an institution a symbotype or a phenotype? And we have the same problem in biology. You know, are the dopamine receptors in your brain part of your phenotype or your genotype? You can measure them. It evolves. At the same time, there's something about it which is on the inside rather than on the outside. And so these are some of the deep questions that we need to ask. I haven't mentioned stories much, but of course they're so important as vehicles for all of this. Absolutely. But not only stories, because when you were talking, Leano, I wanted to add, you know, we learn in stories, we also learn in experiences. And I think that Stu, among other people on this call, will, if you look at rituals, for example, that's not just stories, that's actually experiences. And making things habitual, I think is a big part of it. So this is a huge topic that we're just going to, I mean, I think we're privileged really to be the ones that with many others are involved in studying it. Kathleen, and then Beth, and then Mark.
I echo the statement that you just made, that we're so privileged to be able to consider these topics. And I want to thank you, David. I feel very privileged to have been exposed to such a dense and concise explanation of these grand overarching theories. And my response is sort of a combination of reactions and maybe questions that can't be answered. But one of the things that I was thinking about was the fact that at the center of this argument or this exploration is what is consciousness? You know, what's the definition of consciousness? And I don't think we really know. And we don't understand the link between what we consider mind, that exchange of energy and information between two brains, and the physiological functioning of the brain, and the phrase that Sage put out about meaning being a property of context, an emergent property of context, is so true. But learning doesn't just happen in words. Learning starts at the very beginning of life. You know, I don't believe that all life in utero needs to be sacred, but those forming human beings inside their mother's bodies are learning, and there is meaning attached to their physical experience. And the early parts of our human learning is physiological, and it's building on relationship aspects of who we are and what it is, you know, whatever our consciousness is. So
Yeah.
I guess what I'm getting to is that the relationship piece is really vital. And what is so important about the behavioral contextual theory and the integration with the acceptance and commitment theory is it does focus on values, and it does, I really think that idea of a personal evolution by recognizing the, navigating one's self-experience within a world of values and meaning, and then bringing that together as a group and deciding together what are we as a collective identity is so important to cultural evolution. And to finalize my sort of incoherent and emerging thoughts is, I do see this need to have culture replace genes as life becomes more complex and the organizing of the brain is less embedded in genetic information and more embedded in experience. I guess that's enough for now.
So much to say there, Kathleen, and what I'll choose to say is, first of all, isn't it nice we are in an ongoing community where we could revisit this again and again and again. So this doesn't stop with this lecture, but I am totally unabashed at thinking about the worldview that we're trying to create as just like a religion. And the main difference being is that we have a greater responsibility to base what we say on science than before. And every culture is said to have both the proto-scientific mode of reasoning, because there's always context in which it's really important to know the facts of the matter. And so therefore, all cultures recognize that context. And in that context, you better tell the truth. If you don't, there'll be consequences. It's like a court trial. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And if you don't, there's consequences. So, and yet in other contexts, then anything goes in terms of adaptive fictions. And so the challenge is to come up with a meaning system which imbues us with values, strong on values, gets us up in the morning, and causes us to do the right thing, for which governance is, and is justified by the best of our current scientific knowledge. And the third part is the new part. The third part is the new part. And if we succeed at that, then I think we will have what actually humanists from the very beginning were searching for, a science of man, a religion of man. And all the way back to the Enlightenment, there was just like, what can we replace religion with, basically? If by religion we mean counterfactual beliefs. So it goes on like that. Wonderful conversation to be having. Mark, Stuart, and Hank. Beth, where did you go? You had a comment.
I did, but I would love for these other folks to have an opportunity first.
Okay. Mark.
David, thank you so much for your this wonderful example, a continuing example of how evolutionary science can be used to integrate so many fields of human knowledge. And in my case, as a clinical social worker in the contextual science tradition, using primarily acceptance and commitment therapy, it was just a wonderful example of that type of integration in particular. And Sage very precisely and eloquently made some connections that I'm just building on here. But it's so challenging when you're a therapist, I think, to be sitting in a room with somebody trying to help them and get so much data coming at you, and the ability of the matrix that many people here seem to be familiar with to help simplify the data coming in and make it meaningful. It is so helpful in being able to get to sort of a core principle of how to help someone find their values, become more dedicated to them, and brush away some of the underbrush that stops them from getting at their values, and to keep your eye sort of on something very central. It's such a helpful a tool, and yet at the same time to then recognize that this approach to psychotherapy, this applied behavioral science, is situated in the broader evolutionary sciences, and what you're doing makes sense at the broadest level, even though it's helping you at the most, immediate level. It is so exciting and helpful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And Astra, Mio Wilson, people like that, including Steve Hayes. And Steve Hayes has been a very, very important person in my life. Something which I haven't emphasized good, and we can in the future, is just how confusing academic science has been, and how much integration is needed and is taking place. But for those of you that are familiar with it, we can start with behaviorism as a once dominant position in academic science, and then strangely it was deposed by something called the cognitive revolution. What was that? And then that morphed into evolutionary psychology. What was that? Then that was it goes, and evolutionary psychology envisioned itself as very different from the standard social science model. What was that? All of this needs to come together, and is coming together. But it just shows you how much the so-called scientific revolution is still a work in progress. And that's something which I think strongly about and written about, that the last 50 years is not percent of the last 500 years. What's happened in the last 50 years is just like so much more impactful in terms of the way that we're thinking now, including the whole advent of complex system science, there was no possibility of that before the advent of widespread computing, and the constraints that put on all aspects of our science and theorizing, as we're only just discovering, and then that being separate from evolutionary science, it too coming on just in the last 50 years. And so we're really living in history, friends. And for me, it's helpful to think that, to have that clearly in my mind, that we're taking part in historical developments which can be catalyzed so that it can take place. It doesn't have to be decadal. It doesn't have to require 10, 50, 100 years. It will if we don't do something, or it will not take place at all if we don't do something. But if we do the right thing, then we could really catalyze change. And that's one of the things that gets me out of bed in the morning, which makes this a strong meaning system for me. So, Hank and Stuart, you had your hand up before. Do you want to?
I did. Let me see if I can say something relatively simple about something very complicated. Now, notice, as I said those words, you likely had some reaction to it, from who the hell is this guy to, oh, what does he have to say? And so you orient to what I'm going to say next with a certain degree of motivation. And so that, I think, David Sage speaks to the import of some of the developments in relational frame theory for the distinction that you're drawing between symbotype and phenotype, because there's the words that I say, but there's the reaction that's evoked and the motivation that we experience and what we orient to next. And within the updated version of RFT, that's called the ROAM, relating, orienting, evoking, and motivating as a single unit of analysis. Ernest Becker won the Nobel Prize for the denial of death, and one of the things he said was the cruelest paradox of all is that the concept of infinity resides in a finite brain. And there are other paradoxes. We teach kids with autism to speak, and then they learn to worry about themselves as being different and odd, right? And we teach kids that words go along with things, and we divide up the world, and then we spend the rest of our lives trying to put things back together. And so too with symbotype and phenotype. I mean, I think that vertical line through the matrix should be a dotted line, right? Because we separate those things out, but they go together, right? There's some research evidence now suggesting that we need to think about relating and orienting and evoking and motivating as a single unit that we can divide up for analytic purposes, but they go together, right? Our history with words makes a difference for how we take in words and what we orient to. And from the point of view of ACT and therapy, then we can think about challenging the relating, the words, or the evoking, the function, or what people orient to and notice next, as well as their motivation. So hopefully at some point as part of this research series, Beth, one of the group of RFT researchers who are studying this Rome unit could weigh in too, because I think it would shed some interesting light on what Sage and David are bringing to us so eloquently. Thank you both.
Stu, I regard relational frame theory as absolutely foundational for this. And part of the catalysis that I mentioned previously is to make it known to a much, much, much larger community. And in my experience, when I mention RFT to colleagues who are not part of the CBS community, I'm saying without exception, I cannot think of a single exception of a person who's ever heard of it. And yet it is so very important. And so one of the things that's exactly what I mean by catalysis. If nothing is done, then that'll persist for decades or might never change. But we can do it in a matter of years. And the research program, as you know, Stu, but I'll just briefly mention it to the other. This research program built around a master class on the science of the noosphere is going to take 100 people through a journey from the origin of life to the future of the internet, all centered around Teilhard's concept of the noosphere. And Teilhard's whole worldview is a value-laden, value-infused evolutionary worldview. It's evolution with values. And he has a lot to say about consciousness, basically, as evolution reflecting upon itself. We're going to take a cohort of people through that journey, and we're going to be measuring the change in their symbotype, reflected in their own words as they write about it and talk about it. We're going to be there as scientists studying it using relational frame theory, along with other people and other approaches. And so that is like way high up on that y-axis, basic science, way high up on that. And of course, also way high over on the x-axis in terms of both asking the big questions and with practical utility. That's the kind of research program that we can do again and again and again, and starting more or less now with some of the work you're doing. I mean, the separate program that you're doing with the alphabet soup is another research program like that. The idea that we have this strong research dimension along with all the other great work we're doing is part of the way I imagine this organization. Hank and Glenn, and then Beth. And Beth, we might end with you if we want to stick to time, although I don't need to rush off.
Oh, good. So I have a few minutes to
Yeah, please take your
pose
time.
a thought and ask a question. I come at it from a psychotherapist point of view. First, so I'll tell you a little story. The story is something like this. A client of mine was, he's saying, about a marital thing. And he goes, my wife, she needs help. And I'm using my words. Her words is finding her purpose in life as a woman in her mid to late 50s and finding meaning. So I'm listening to a lot of what's going on from, of course, this sort of macro, meso, micro perspective. So separate from how I might work with it, my question here is in terms of cultural trait evolution, is finding meaning, I'm picking people's brains now, especially David, you and Sage, and maybe the others, would you say that's a trait, that meaning-making skill. Some people say it might be genetically wired. Some people can do it better than others. I think of it as primarily culturally evolved, but maybe some of you could, if I'm clear enough, can you say, is meaning making a phenotype? And is it a trait that's evolved over time, or is it a genotype? And I don't know, that's the opening to it. I don't know if anybody, if I'm clear enough for people to respond.
Yeah, well, what I would say, I'll give you a simplistic answer, and then all of us will immediately regard it as too simplistic. But for me, the simplistic answer is a meaning system is a symbotype. A symbotype is a newfangled word for a meaning system. A meaning system by itself, it motivates behavior. Depending on what your meaning system is, that will influence how you behave. Change your meaning system, change your behavior. So that makes a meaning system like a genotype. And yes, you can study it. You can, it's actually quite transparent. One of the things that's so great about cultural evolution, with biological evolution, if you want to go into mechanisms and development, then you really have to do all this kind of, mechanistic molecular biology stuff. That's hard, at least it is for me. But in the case of cultural evolution, the analog of that is in plain sight because it's in language, and it's much more in plain sight. So in that sense, it's a phenotype. But for the most part, I think a symbotype is a newfangled word for a meaning system, a worldview, a theory, a religion. All of these things are something inside our heads which influence how we act, and they're primarily cultural. Of course, there's a whole genetic architecture that makes it possible in the first place, but and there's genetic influences. Everything's heritable. So anyhow, it goes on like.
Just one more. If we take it to another level, let's say on a clinical level, we'd say this person has a problem, or let's say a deficit in meaning making or symbotype skill. Can you bring that to the more macro level, like in terms of how you might look at that? Not so for the individual, but can we look at it as differences in cultural development of that skill, or their cultural interferences? I mean, how would one look at it from that point of view, which is really what I'm interested in as well?
Well, I think if you, Steve Hayes, along with Stefan Hoffman and myself, organized a special issue of Clinical Psychology Review on clinical science from an evolutionary perspective, where I think would be very interesting for all of us to read. And one of the points to make is that everything we do is multi-context, multi-level. And so when it comes to what we call therapy, which is just basically a guided form of evolution, it's a form of conscious evolution. It can take place at the personal level, but it can also take place at larger levels. So any middle level identity actually is a product of cultural evolution leading up to the present. It might be adaptive or not. I hope I made that point, that the adaptationist program is not saying everything is adaptive. And so when we look at something, we need to know its history. And then we need to know, was it adaptive in the past? And especially what is it in the present? And so often, if somebody's seeking help, then almost by definition, things aren't working well for them. And the way they've come to be is mismatched with their current environment. And so they need assistance, basically. And that takes place at all levels, and if the problem is at higher levels, then that really hems in the individual. There's some things that the individual can't do on their own. Really, systemic level change is required. I mean, you have to do something to preserve yourself. So it goes on like that. So that's part of the long conversation. I think every answer is inadequate to the question, and if we're a conversation like this. When?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, it's a great talk, David. I appreciate it. can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So one of the ideas that came up to me as you're talking, and as also Liano was talking, is this perception of religion as like anti-scientific, like the thing that makes this a little ambiguous is is the idea of values, which comes up here. Just the when you gave that chart of words having different meanings, I think a lot of it has to do with a value system. And also, let me just give an example to clarify what I'm thinking. You can look at religion as a virus and parasitic, and there's some aspects with context where that's true. But even in just, David, the example you gave with when there was a plague, there were people who were willing to sacrifice their life to go into the hospital. They had a story in their head, something to do with love, and that we should love one another, and they were willing to suffer and sacrifice in order to express that love. And they weren't, but they also value certainty, like the meaning, a meaning that's above the concrete things that we see in everyday life. And they create this story of Jesus, and they believe it, and it gives them certainty. So they don't value, like David, you and I, we can live with a certain amount of uncertainty, and until things become more, proven in science. But their tolerance for that uncertainty, they rather value, they value certainty even if it's not accurate. But they'll value something like something that's relational, and meaning like love, and they're willing to put willing to tolerate the difficulties to love other people. So I just see a conflict between, like when you say something, David, like you envision a world where we can create stories with that aren't counterfactual, but until we get all the facts, people and because people have different values, they're going to come to conclusions other than yours, and it's not necessarily. I mean, there's some aspects of it that's bad, and there's some aspects that it's good. Like, for example, loving others. So I don't know, just putting it out there. I don't.
Well, Glenn, thank you very much, and it makes me feel even more inadequate in some ways in terms of the rush of ideas. So let me slow down just a little bit. I won't take more than a few minutes, but the issues that you've raised are very, very important. And I feel that I misrepresented myself. I feel like what I said was a misrepresentation of not only what I feel, but also what I say and write about. So let me just try again. And in the first place, to point out that every human being has a meaning system. We might call it religion or not, but every human being has some set of symbolic system inside their head, which is motivating what they do, which is animating them and motivating what they do. That's point one. Point two is that this trade-off between what I sometimes call factual and practical realism, that a meaning system that actually does its job and causes you to thrive in this world, as you were saying, often relies on counterfactuals, and that's true for all meaning systems. It's not the case that only religions do this. I mean, any meaning system, if you look at it only a little bit, you will find all kinds of counterfactual, adaptive fictions. That's not a statement about religion. That's a statement about almost all meaning systems. Why is it that most people think they're above average? Why is it that in a conflict situation we tend to demonize our enemies?
So where do you think in your scientific perspective you have some counterfactual kind of stuff?
I could Can I duck that question?
I'll answer it.
Go ahead. Answer it, Frank.
Actually, right now, there's a group of people that are deliberately refounding physics on counterfactuals. It's a theory called constructivism, and so that's all about talking about the natural laws as counterfactuals of things that what is not allowed, and anything that isn't not allowed is allowed.
Yeah, yeah. But I think that to keep things within bounds, I think that Kurt Johnson, who's a very important member of our community, I think many of you know him, I think represents, Glenn, I would like to think, a perspective that you would feel comfortable with. And it has to do with the concept of interspirituality, which on the one hand is very respectful of existing meaning systems, and at the same time provides a meeting ground for all meaning systems, what they call first and second tier consciousness. And this is very important, especially in this day and age where we have to pay attention to and respect indigenous knowledge, in addition to the great religious traditions. But the final point, I think, is that what you find again and again is that, and if you look at it, for example, the Dalai Lama's Ethics for Whole Earth and the Our Common Home encyclical, what you find is that people like the Dalai Lama are saying there's almost 8 billion people in this world and they'll never share the same religion. And we need to have something that applies to everybody. What would that be? And then he attempts to state ethical principles, basically, in a way. And if they don't rely on any particular tradition, what can they rely on? It's in this sense that you really need the science to provide some kind of justificatory basis, some kind of foundation for when somebody says, who says, why should I believe this? And you cannot fall back upon any particular religion because you're trying to speak to the whole world. It's at that point that you have to provide some other justification for universal ethical principles in a global world. So that's the best way I can do here. But it's very, very important and it's important not just scientifically, but also diplomatically, that when we talk with so many people, that we are fully respectful of their way of thinking of things. And I think actually that the biological perspective is a help here, because if you're a biologist, you think every species is amazing. You respect every species as a product of evolution, stretching back to the origin of life in an unbroken chain. It doesn't matter if the species is a parasite or a predator, or there's something magnificent about each and every species. And I think the same token, there's something magnificent about any culture which has survived to the present. It's got to be doing something right. And so you can admire it for its adaptedness as a life form. And then at the same time, you can question, you can also examine it in terms of how well is it functioning for its members and especially for others. So there's something about the biological point of view, I think, which does provide the respect for every living thing, and therefore every living cultural life form, I think, gets that amount of respect. And I think that's pretty interesting that you can be able to say that. Beth.
Thank you, David. Well, it's good that I'm the possibly the last one, I suppose. I just wanted to say that one opportunity that we have here during this research seminar series is to, really share and learn from each other's research methods, how best to evaluate and measure change. And I was, so I'm looking forward to future presentations that might get into the weeds with that. I just wanted to mention that. And I was really interested in the cultural heat map that you presented, David, related to the frequency of Bible verses most cited. And just that, how you visually represented that data. I really like that. So I noted it. Maybe we can use that moving forward. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to say is I look forward to learning more about more, research methods and folks, if you want to present, please let us know. And,
as we geek out on these things, I think, and those kinds of methods, and here Sage comes back into the picture because with your training in urban informatics, it's all about finding information. It could be by biblical citations, but it could be so much else that we could actually, this is data that exists in abundance all around us and that we're assembling for the purpose. And I think that there's a whole domain to be developed there that is part of what of what's on our agenda. So I think we can look forward to more methods like that. Sage, do you have anything you want to say about that? Why don't you have the last word?
Just that drawing the bridge of what you said, it's the phrase to keep in mind and look for. Our species are naturally occurring data in human language of all kinds of symbolic behavior, not even language. The naturally occurring data that is all around us, that is in the transcript of this recording and all over the place. There are just like so many untapped areas, including in other fields as well. So I just think that's like discovering a new continent for a biologist.
Yeah, it is. Okay, well, thanks for being fellow travelers on the journey, friends. And we have constructed a system for ongoing interactions, which is what we try to do in all of our projects and what I think we've succeeded in doing for ourselves. And so all good. We will see you next time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Thanks everybody for coming. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Awesome.